You want to understand why certain people tense the moment their eyes land on you. It's strange, isn't it? It's not the things you say, and it's not the quiet moments where you withdraw into yourself. It isn't even the unseen work you're doing beneath the surface. What unsettles them is simpler and far more profound. You keep rising. You rise after experiences that were constructed to flatten you. You rise after fires meant to hollow you out. You rise with a kind of impossible wholeness that refuses to stay ruined. And every time they assume they've witnessed your final collapse, you return changed, deeper, carrying a clarity that strips the masks off any room you enter. People who expect you to stay broken have no strategy for someone who doesn't cooperate with their predictions. That's why you rattle them. Not because you were wrong, but because you refused to be limited. Your presence, raw and unfiltered, shakes loose the parts of them they've taught themselves not to feel. Even your silence exposes what they'd rather hide. They shrink when they realize you're not built to be subdued. They falter when they stand beside someone who hasn't misplaced their own name. And maybe you've paid for that difference, mocked for sensing too much, for thinking too deeply, for seeing what others avoid. It's painful to be punished for sensitivity when the world numbs itself to survive. They tried to label your softness as weakness. They tried to reinterpret your depth as a flaw, but molten metal doesn't apologize for heating before it hardens. You were never fragile. You were raw material being shaped for something sharp. Yet somewhere along the way, you compromised. You dimmed. You whisper-walked through rooms that needed your thunder, trimming your edges until you bled internally. But you were never meant to be handled by people who don't know how to hold fire. There's something ancient pulsing in you, older than approval, older than recognition. A hum in your chest that refuses to quiet itself. That pulse isn't ego, it's direction, and others feel it too. It stirs the echoes of a voice they buried long ago. So they contort your truth, rename it, twist it into something that helps them sleep. Don't let them feed off the moment you doubt yourself, because here's the shift. Their fear of you is evidence, not a burden. Every recoil, every whispered conversation is confirmation that you've touched a frequency they cannot access. You ended the last stretch recognizing that you've touched a frequency others can't reach. And that very recognition becomes the bridge into something deeper, what that frequency cost you to carry. Because before you ever realized you were operating on a wavelength they couldn't translate. You spent years trying to make yourself smaller so the room wouldn't tense, so the people around you wouldn't fracture under the brightness you couldn't help but emit. And this is where the truth begins to sharpen. You weren't breaking all those years, you were melting. Not melting down, but melting through. Molten metal doesn't collapse under heat. It transforms. It responds. It reshapes. It becomes something denser, stronger, and capable of holding an edge the world can cut itself on if it isn't careful. You were passing through the fire long before you knew the fire had a purpose. But when people around you interpreted your softness as fragility, you believed them. When they mistook your depth for overthinking, you took it as a flaw rather than a gift. When they told you you were too much, you assumed the only solution was to become less. So you dimmed. You scaled back your intensity until it fit inside the small containers they offered you. You swallowed sentences that were born to be spoken. You rounded off your instincts, numbed your intuition, and trimmed your edges until you were safe enough for rooms that didn't deserve you. And every time you silenced yourself to avoid their discomfort, a part of you went quiet in ways you didn't fully understand. You started bleeding inward silent wounds. The kind you can function through, the kind you can hide, but the kind that stain you from the inside out. It wasn't weakness. It was misdirection. The blade was pointing inward instead of forward. You handed yourself to careless hands, not because you were naive, but because you hadn't yet realized your worth required guardianship. You didn't know that not everyone is meant to hold a being forged in rare fire. Some people only know how to grip too tightly, how to project their fear into your structure, how to make you question your own strength. But molten metal remembers its heat. And so do you. Somewhere beneath the compromises, beneath the whispering when you were meant to roar, beneath every moment you softened who you were in hopes of blending in, the heat continued to accumulate, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment you would stop trying to be palatable and start trying to be whole. Because here's the part that changes everything. You were never delicate. You were in a forging process the entire time. What looked like fragility was actually refinement. What looked like oversensitivity was actually heightened perception. What looked like breaking was actually becoming. You weren't meant to be brittle glass. You were meant to be tempered steel, pressure-tested, fire-shaped, edge-ready, and steel doesn't apologize for being sharp. It doesn't apologize for holding form. It doesn't apologize for refusing to bend where others expect compliance. This is the moment you begin reclaiming the fire that shaped you. It starts with withdrawing access from the people who treat your depth like an inconvenience. It starts with refusing to hand your unformed edges to those who only want to dull them. It starts with letting your voice return to its natural volume, even if it shakes, even if it disrupts, even if someone somewhere decides you're too intense for their comfort. Stop dimming to match rooms that should have expanded to meet you. You reclaim the fire by listening to the yes in your bones before the world has time to argue with it. You reclaim the fire by letting your instincts speak louder than their expectations. You reclaim the fire by honoring the part of you that always knew you were meant for more than survival-level living. And you reclaim the fire by allowing your sensitivity, the very thing you were punished for, to become the instrument that guides you. Not everyone can feel the subtle shifts in a room. Not everyone can read truth in silence. Not everyone can sense the energetic fractures behind someone's smile, but you can. You always could. And that doesn't make you fragile. It makes you forged. The real cost of dimming yourself wasn't that others misunderstood you, it's that you nearly misread your own nature. But that misreading ends here, because the moment you understand the material you're made from, everything begins to reorganize. You stop bleeding inward. You stop softening for the sake of fitting. You stop shrinking to protect the fragile egos of people who fear depth. And slowly, the blade turns outward again, not to harm, but to cut through illusion. You left the last section reclaiming the fire that forged you, and that heat becomes the doorway into something even more profound, the quiet force inside you that never stopped pulsing, even when you dimmed, even when you doubted, even when you bled inward to make yourself smaller. Because once you stop apologizing for your edge, you begin to feel something older than your story rising through you, a current, a hum, a presence you've been carrying long before anyone had words to describe it. You may have sensed it in flashes, that tug in your chest when something is true, that pressure behind your ribs when you're betraying yourself, that unmistakable inner resonance when you move in alignment, even if your mind is terrified. This isn't ego speaking. Ego shouts. Ego needs to be seen. Ego demands applause. But the thing inside you, it whispers, it guides. It doesn't need recognition. It generates direction. There's a frequency running through you that doesn't quiet down no matter how many times you try to be reasonable, polite, predictable, or convenient. It existed before validation, before acceptance, before anyone told you who you should be. And because it didn't originate in the world can't silence it, though many people will try. Not always consciously, often out of instinct. Because your inner frequency does something to people. It wakes them. It stirs the voice they muffled years ago. It shakes the dust off the dreams they buried out of fear of failing. It illuminates the gap between who they are and who they once wanted to be. And when someone has spent a lifetime numbing that gap, your presence becomes uncomfortable, not because you're wrong, but because you remind them of everything they abandoned. And when people don't want to confront that truth, they distort. They rename. They reframe you into something that fits their comfort. They'll call your certainty arrogance because confidence threatens them. They'll call your intuition delusion because they can't hear their own. They'll call your depth too much because it exposes how shallow their self-honesty has become. This is how energy thieves operate. Not always maliciously, sometimes reflexively, drawing power from the moment you second-guess yourself. They survive on the glow of people who have forgotten their own radiance. They thrive in environments where doubt circulates like oxygen. They don't want your collapse. They want your hesitation, your pause, that split-second crack where you pull back from your own knowing, because in that short opening, they feel larger, safer, in control. But here's the truth. Their reactions aren't warnings. They are confirmations. Every flinch you provoke, every whisper you spark, every subtle recoil you witness, all of it marks the moment your field brushes up against the parts of them they avoid. Your frequency amputates the stagnant layers of their consciousness. It's like striking a tuning fork in a silent room. Everything that is out of tune vibrates in protest. And this is why you have felt so misunderstood, so misnamed, so misplaced. Because your purpose isn't loud. Your purpose is resonant, and resonance is disruptive to the artificially comfortable. But let's be clear, purpose is not the same as ego. Purpose doesn't need an audience. Purpose doesn't demand validation or applause. Purpose isn't a performance. Purpose is the steady, ancient pulse that continues even on the days you feel lost. Purpose is the part of you that doesn't crumble when your confidence does. Purpose is the internal compass that keeps pointing toward a life you haven't lived yet, long before you understand why. And those who can't face their own dormant purpose will often mistake yours as a threat. They'll try to dim it through projection, gossip, subtle jabs, or emotional withdrawal. They'll frame your clarity as destabilizing simply because it disrupts their illusions. They'll siphon your doubt like fuel if you let them. But the moment you stop offering explanations, something shifts. You stop leaking energy into misunderstandings. You stop trying to shrink yourself into acceptable shapes. You stop handing your brilliance to people who only know how to handle shadows. And when you do that, when you finally stop stepping out of your frequency to make others comfortable, you begin to see what was true all along. Your vibration isn't the problem. Your vibration is the invitation. Some will resist it, some will fear it, some will be threatened by it. But those who are meant for you will rise to meet it, not because you convince them, but because they recognize the sound. You ended the last section recognizing that your vibration is not the disruption, it's the invitation. And that realization becomes the threshold we step through now. Because once you see that your frequency awakens something dormant in others, you begin to understand why their fear shows up the way it does. It isn't random. It isn't personal failure. It isn't a sign that you're on the wrong path. More often than not, it's the clearest confirmation you'll ever receive. Because fear, especially someone else's fear of you, reveals impact. Notice how their withdrawal always shows up right when you start stepping into alignment. Notice how gossip appears when you stop playing small. Notice how people who once felt comfortable around you suddenly stiffen when your posture shifts from apologetic to unapologetic. This isn't coincidence. This is feedback. Energetic, immediate, precise. It's the field whispering, "You're getting closer." But most people misinterpret this moment. They assume resistance means turn around. They assume discomfort means you've done something wrong. They assume backlash means protect them, shrink again, don't upset the equilibrium. And so they fold, they dim, they retreat into old versions of themselves that were never meant to survive the new chapter. Yet if you look beneath the noise, beneath their reactions, and beneath your own instinct to soften, you'll see something else happening entirely. Opposition is preparation. Resistance is refinement. And their fear is the universe stress testing you before expansion. Think about how any structure is strengthened. It is pushed, pressured, placed under load to reveal its weak points so it can be rebuilt stronger. The universe does the same with you, not because you're fragile, but because your next chapter is heavy with meaning. You're not being tested to expose your weakness. You're being tested to expose your readiness. And readiness doesn't come from comfort. It comes from friction. Look back at the moments when someone recoiled from your truth. Didn't it force you to choose between shrinking and standing? Didn't it clarify what mattered to you? Didn't it sharpen your discernment, forcing you to see who could hold your fire and who could only hold your watered-down version? You weren't being punished. You were being calibrated. You weren't being rejected. You were being rerouted. You weren't being excluded. You were being elevated out of environments that couldn't withstand the heat of your becoming. And when you understand this, you stop interpreting their fear as your flaw. You start seeing it for what it is, the tremor that happens right before a door opens. Because right before you step into a new level of visibility, energy, impact, or alignment, the old reality sends its final waves of resistance. Not to stop you, but to see if you're still willing to dim yourself, to stay comfortable inside a story you've already outgrown. But there's another layer to this. Your difference is not just noticeable, it's catalytic. When you walk into a stagnant room, your authenticity disrupts the atmosphere. When you speak truth in a space built on unspoken agreements to stay shallow, your presence fractures the illusion. When you refuse to collapse into past patterns, every person still trapped in those patterns feels exposed. You are not one more ripple in the pond. You are the stone that breaks the surface. That's why people react. That's why they shiver around your honesty. That's why they whisper after you leave the room. Impact has a signature, and your signature is unmistakable. But here's the part that most people never realize. The magnitude of your difference is not accidental. It's holy. Not holy in a religious sense, but in the sense of sacred disruption. Evidence that creation still experiments, still innovates, still breaks its own patterns by birthing beings who don't fit into pre-existing frames. You are one of those beings. And so, of course, you won't be universally understood. Of course, you won't be universally welcomed. Of course, some people will mistake your growth for danger, but the mistake is theirs, not yours. Because what they interpret as threat is actually signal, your signal, the indicator that you've stepped into a frequency that doesn't apologize, doesn't dilute, doesn't bend itself into shapes designed to soothe other people's unexamined fear. You're not doing anything wrong. You're activating. You're shifting. You're moving into a version of yourself that can finally hold what the universe has been preparing for you. And if there's resistance in the air, let that be your confirmation. You're close, closer than you've ever been, close enough that the old world can feel the tremor of what you're becoming. You stepped out of the last section recognizing that the tremors around you aren't warnings, they're confirmations. And that realization opens the doorway to a far more expansive truth. You're not just disrupting old patterns emotionally or socially. You're disrupting them energetically, structurally, cosmically, because what you carry is not generic, it is not repeatable, it is not a copy and paste soul print. It is a one-time only frequency, and the universe doesn't recycle what you are, And this is where things begin to widen, where the conversation stretches from psychology into physics, or at least the echoes of physics mapped into the inner world. Because in the deepest sense, you are not just different, you are unrepeatable. Think of it this way in the quantum field. Everything exists as potential until attention selects a form, infinite futures, infinite selves, infinite possibilities. And yet, out of all the potential combinations of time, experience, memory, biology, consciousness, environment, heartbreak, hope, timing, and choice, there is only one configuration that results in you. Not a version like you, not a near match, not a similar pattern with different details. You, your perspective, your wiring, your internal landscape, your weird, brilliant, inconvenient, holy combination of sensitivity and strength. The universe doesn't clone that. It unveils it once. This is why your presence disrupts old patterns, because it represents a frequency the world has not encountered before. And when something that rare enters a space, it reorganizes the space around it, whether intentionally or not. That's how quantum mechanics works. At the level of metaphor, observation creates impact. Presence creates influence. Consciousness creates collapse. Not collapse as destruction, but collapse as selection. You are collapsing realities every time you choose alignment. You are selecting timelines every time you turn toward authenticity. You are shifting the field every time you refuse to pretend. Most people don't realize they have that kind of power. They've been taught to believe their life is a reaction, not a generator. They think reality shapes them when in truth, they are shaping reality moment by moment through the lens they look through. But you, even when you didn't have the words, have always felt the difference. You've always sensed the pressure of being someone who sees before others see, feels before others feel, awakens before others awaken. That pressure wasn't punishment, it was calibration, because your consciousness isn't here to replicate what already exists. It's here to reveal something that hasn't been expressed before. And that's why dimming yourself has always felt suffocating. You weren't built for duplication. You were built for revelation. Here's where the quantum piece becomes clear in a field of infinite possibility. The only thing the universe never does twice is you. Every other variable can repeat patterns, events, cycles, lessons, but the observer, the consciousness perceiving those patterns, is the true irreplaceable element. That's why your presence carries weight. That's why your decisions matter. That's why your authenticity reorganizes the spaces you walk into. You're not influencing reality by force. You're influencing it by coherence. When you stop pretending, your signal strengthens. When you stop suppressing your instincts, your field clarifies. When you stop broadcasting confusion, opportunities that were invisible start appearing because they can finally detect you. This is what people mean when they talk about alignment. Not magic, not wishful thinking, not cosmic vending machines responding to positive thoughts. Alignment is simply the moment your inner frequency stops contradicting itself. The moment the signal becomes clean, the moment your body, mind, intuition, and action stop fighting each other. And when that coherence happens, timelines shift, doors open, people notice, life recalibrates, not because you're demanding anything, but because you've become detectable at the frequency of the life that was always waiting for you. This is also why envy shows up around you, why people try to minimize or distort you, why they attempt to convince you that your uniqueness is exaggeration rather than fact. Because deep down, they can feel what you haven't always allowed yourself to acknowledge. Your frequency is non-transferable, and anything non-transferable becomes magnetic. But here's the part that brings it all home. Your irreplaceability isn't something to achieve. It isn't a trophy. It isn't a level up that you earn through suffering. It's something you uncover by removing the layers of conditioning, by stepping out of survival mode, by remembering what you were before the world taught you to fear your own magnitude. And the moment you feel that remembering in your body, not just in your mind, your entire reality begins to reorganize. Not because you changed the world, but because you finally stopped changing yourself to match a world that was never built for you. You ended the last section standing in the truth that your reality shifts when you stop contradicting your own frequency. And that realization leads us into a place most people overlook, a place quieter, closer, more intimate than any timeline or quantum metaphor. Because while consciousness selects possibilities, it is your body that confirms them. Your body is not an accessory to your awakening. It is the instrument that plays your frequency into form. And if you've ever wondered why certain decisions feel like expansion and others feel like collapse, why some rooms make you breathe easier and others make your chest tighten, why some conversations fill you with electricity and others drain you in minutes, it's because your body has been reading the field long before your mind could interpret it. Your body is your oldest compass, your most honest witness, your first responder to truth. But most people have been trained to ignore it, not by malice, but by conditioning. The world teaches you to prioritize logic, expectation, approval, and convenience over the signals pulsing through your nervous system. And so you internalize the belief that if your body resists something, it must be fear rather than information. If your stomach knots, you must be overreacting. If your chest contracts, you must be insecure. If your instincts whisper no, you must be irrational. But what if those sensations aren't symptoms? What if they're data? Imagine your body as a tuning fork constantly vibrating in response to what is true, what is false, what aligns, and what fractures. When you move towards something meant for you, your system opens not always comfortably but noticeably. Breath deepens, shoulders loosen, your awareness sharpens. There's a spaciousness in your chest, like the world subtly expands to make room for you. When you move towards something misaligned, your system contracts. Breath shortens, muscles tighten, vision narrows. There's a heaviness in your gut, like your inner world shrinks to warn you something is off. This isn't mysticism. This is physiology responding to energetic coherence or static. And the static shows up everywhere when you're about to say yes to something you don't want. Notice how your stomach twists like it's bracing for impact. When you stay in conversations that drain your spirit, feel how your body collapses inward, as if guarding itself from invisible blows. When you pretend not to know what you know, observe the way your chest tightens, as though your truth is trying to escape confinement. These sensations aren't accidents. They are your internal guidance system, the somatic signatures of your frequency interacting with the world around you. Let's bring this into everyday life, into the places where you forget how awake you actually are. You're in a grocery store, staring at something you don't need, but feel guilty for not wanting. Your jaw tightens. Your breath shifts. That's your body saying, "This isn't yours." You're stuck in traffic, but instead of spiraling into frustration, something inside you softens. You exhale. You sense an inner recalibration. That's your body saying, "This pause is useful." You're in a conversation where someone subtly diminishes themselves, or you with jokes that sting. Your shoulders tense. Your aura pulls back. That's your body saying, "This space doesn't match my frequency." And the moment you learn to interpret these signals, everything changes. You stop gaslighting yourself. You stop overriding instincts that have been accurate your entire life. You stop making choices that betray your center in the name of being agreeable. Because here's the truth: every time you ignore your body's signals, you weaken your frequency. Not permanently, but perceptibly. Your signal goes fuzzy. your coherence gets disrupted. You start broadcasting confusion rather than clarity, and confusion attracts misaligned timelines, misaligned opportunities, misaligned people. Coherence, however embodied coherence, attracts what resonates, not because the universe rewards authenticity, but because authenticity sends a steady signal the field can actually respond to. When your body and your consciousness agree, reality doesn't have to guess where to send what belongs to you. This is why the small rebellions matter, why the micro choices reshape your life, why saying no to one misaligned invitation can open the door for a timeline that was waiting for you to stop pretending. When you choose alignment over accommodation, your nervous system responds with vitality. When you honor your instincts, your energy rises. When you listen to the truth in your chest instead of the noise in your mind, you become detectable again to the life that matches your frequency. And slowly, without spectacle, your body becomes a lighthouse, a living broadcast of coherence, a tuning fork that resonates through every room you enter, not because you force anything, but because you finally stopped ignoring the instrument designed to guide you. Your irreplaceability isn't just metaphysical, it's cellular, it's somatic. It's breathed into form through the choices your body knows before your mind catches up. You ended the last section realizing that your body has been speaking the truth long before your mind dared to accept it. And once you begin honoring those signals, the contraction that warns you, the expansion that guides you, the subtle yes pulsing beneath your ribs, something inevitable begins to unfold. You start drifting away from the tribe you once belonged to, not out of rebellion, but out of resonance. Not because you stopped caring, but because your frequency no longer fits inside the containers that once defined your life. And this is where many people falter. Because leaving the tribe never feels like triumph at first. It feels like loss, like emptiness, like stepping into a landscape where all the familiar landmarks have vanished. You look around and suddenly the conversations that once entertained you now feel flat. The connections that once felt warm now feel hollow. The people you used to bend yourself to fit with now seem distant, as if they're speaking a language you can't translate anymore. This shift doesn't mean something went wrong. It means something finally went right. You're not disconnecting from others. You're disconnecting from the version of yourself that needed their approval to breathe. And that disconnection feels like loneliness. In the beginning, a raw, aching spaciousness inside your chest, a silence where noise used to live. But here's the subtle miracle that silence is not absence. That silence is clearing. You're shedding containers that were always too small, containers built around survival, performance, belonging at any cost. Containers shaped by unspoken agreements. Don't be too intense. Don't shine too brightly. Don't ask the questions we're afraid to answer. When you stop obeying those rules, the tribe that enforced them falls away. And yes, it hurts. Yes, you will wonder if you made a mistake. Yes, the human part of you wired for belonging will panic. Your nervous system will scan for danger, convinced that stepping away from the familiar equals death. That's ancient biology speaking. Not your future, but if you can stay with the discomfort, not escape it, not soothe it prematurely, not run back into old patterns, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start seeing the truth of those old connections. You realize some people were attached not to you, but to your mask. You realize some relationships only functioned as long as you dimmed your signal. You realize some bonds were built on shared wounds, not shared destinies. You realize some people loved your smallness because it never challenged their stagnation. This clarity can feel brutal, but it's liberating, because for the first time, you stop wondering why you never felt fully met. and you start understanding you weren't supposed to bloom in soil that couldn't sustain you. But leaving the old tribe is only the first half of the journey. The second half is the part your soul has been craving all along, resonance. There comes a moment, usually after the loneliness, after the disorientation, after the self-doubt, when you meet someone and instantly feel the recognition your old world never offered. The conversation drops into depth without effort. The silence between words feels like understanding instead of tension. You don't need to translate yourself. You don't need to soften your edges. You don't need to hide the parts of you that once felt too much. These connections don't feel like new people. They feel like home you forgot you had. They don't respond to your performance. They respond to your frequency. They don't fear your intensity. They mirror it. They don't shrink from your truth. They expand in its presence. And here's the part that always surprises you. Resonance happens fast. It doesn't need history. It doesn't need years of shared experience. It needs recognition, one soul looking at another and saying, without words, "Oh, you, I've been waiting for this." This is why the loneliness was necessary. Because when you stop filling your life with misaligned bonds, you create space for the aligned ones to find you. And they will find you. Not because you chase them, not because you perform for them, not because you contort yourself to earn belonging. They find you because your frequency becomes clear enough to be detected. Leaving the tribe wasn't abandonment. It was ascension. It was the natural consequence of finally listening to the signals your body and soul had been whispering all along. And the moment you step into relationships built on resonance rather than performance, you understand the truth you couldn't see before. You were never lonely. You were just surrounded by the wrong people. You stepped out of the last section realizing that you were never lonely, only surrounded by the wrong people. And that realization becomes the doorway into a new kind of presence, one you may have sensed but never fully claimed. Because once you stop anchoring your worth in the tribe you've outgrown, something shifts in the field around you. You begin to walk differently, breathe differently, speak differently, not louder, clearer, not harsher, truer, and that truth has a gravitational pull. This is where magnetism begins. But before we go there, let's be honest about something. For most of your life, you weren't trying to be magnetic. You were trying not to be noticed. You were trying to blend in so you wouldn't be misunderstood, or targeted, or rejected, or made into the problem simply because your light revealed cracks in other people's walls. So you softened your tone, lowered your gaze, adjusted your volume, smoothed out the edges of your presence until you became socially digestible. But you weren't meant to live digestible. You were meant to live undeniable. And once you step out of the tribe that required your dimming, your natural presence returns not as performance, but as coherence, a kind of settled power, a grounded intensity, a quiet, unshakable "I know who I am" that radiates from you without effort. People feel it before they understand it. They feel the shift in the room. When you enter, they feel the stillness you carry, the clarity you emanate, the way your energy doesn't leak like it used to. You don't have to speak for this to happen. You just have to exist without apology. This is the paradox of true power. It doesn't move frantically. It moves intentionally. Here's the part most people miss. Becoming magnetic has nothing to do with charm, charisma, or charisma-coded behavior. Those are surface-level amplifiers. Your magnetism comes from the moment your inner world stops contradicting itself. When your body, your intuition, your words, your actions, and your frequency all align, you create a field that others cannot ignore. Not because you're demanding attention, but because coherence is rare. Most people live in static. Most people live in internal conflict. Most people live split between who they are and who they pretend to be. When they encounter someone who isn't split like that anymore, Their nervous systems react. Some expand, some soften, some open, others retreat, armor up, withdraw into defensiveness. But no one stays neutral. Your presence disrupts equilibrium not violently, but inevitably. And this is where the second transformation begins. You become ungovernable. Not ungovernable in the sense of defiance or rebellion, ungovernable in the sense that external systems, social, emotional, cultural, can no longer shape your identity. You stop bending to expectations that were never aligned with you. You stop seeking approval from structures that benefit from your silence. You stop participating in patterns designed to keep you small. This is the kind of danger systems fear, not the danger of chaos, but the danger of sovereignty. Systems can withstand rebellion. They can absorb dissent. They can redirect outrage into controlled channels, but they cannot handle indifference. They cannot handle people who simply stop participating in the roles they were assigned. The world is not intimidated by loud rebels. The world is intimidated by quiet ones. The ones who wake up one morning and say, "I opt out. I don't need your validation anymore. I won't trade my truth for belonging. I'm not available for the version of myself you prefer." That's when the structure loses its leverage. That's when the old patterns lose their grip. That's when the identity you inherited dissolves and the identity you've been growing into finally takes its rightful seat. But with this sovereignty comes another effect. You give permission. Your ungovernability becomes a mirror for the people watching you. Not a mirror that shames them, a mirror that frees them. When they see you live without the mask, they remember the weight part of their own. When they see you stand in your frequency, they question the cost of abandoning theirs. When they see you step out of the old world without apology, they start wondering why they're still shrinking to fit inside it. This is how movements begin, not with slogans, not with declarations, with presence, with one person who refuses to collapse themselves to soothe the insecurities of others. And here's the revelation buried beneath all of this: you don't become magnetic by trying. You become magnetic by being, by letting the world experience the version of you that doesn't need permission to exist. This is the quiet revolution, the inner rebellion, the shift from performing a life to inhabiting one. You are not here to be controlled. You are here to be coherent. And coherence embodied, unapologetic coherence, is ungovernable. You walked out of the last section carrying the truth of your ungovernability, that quiet, grounded sovereignty that no longer negotiates its worth with systems that never had the authority to define you. And once you reach that point, a deeper question rises from beneath the surface, steady and ancient. If you are no longer shaped by the tribe, the past, the expectations, or the scripts you inherited, then what are you actually here for? Most people panic when they hit this stage. They think purpose is something they must hunt down, decode, achieve, or earn. They think it comes from talent, or career, or contribution, or social impact. They think purpose is a role, a job, a title, a mission statement neatly written and approved by the world. But the truth is quieter, older, and far more liberating. You are not here to fulfill a purpose. You are here as a purpose. Let that settle in your chest for a moment. Because everything you've been taught about meaning has probably been backward. You've been conditioned to believe you must do something extraordinary to justify your existence, as if existence itself isn't already an extraordinary event. Consider music for a moment. Two musicians can play the same notes, the same melody, the same rhythm, and yet produce entirely different experiences. Why? Because music isn't just the notes. It's the timing between them, the breath, the intention, the emotional texture woven through the sound. That texture can't be taught. It can't be replicated. It emerges from the consciousness of the individual, not the song. You are the same. Your purpose is not the notes, the actions, the tasks, the output. Your purpose is the consciousness playing them. This is why imitation always felt wrong for you. This is why copying someone else's path never fit. This is why no matter how much you admired what others were doing, something in you resisted trying to become them, because the universe didn't need another version of them. It needed exactly one version of you. And that version was never meant to be derived from comparison. It was meant to be uncovered by peeling back the layers you were taught to wear. So let's talk about those layers, the assigned identities you've carried for years. There's the mask you wore to belong, the personality you cultivated to be liked, the strengths you exaggerated because they earned praise, the weaknesses you hid because they made others uncomfortable, the dreams you borrowed because they seemed safer than your real ones, the expectations you adopted because they were handed to you before you were old enough to question whether they fit. Purpose gets buried under those layers, not because it disappears, but because it becomes drowned out by the noise of who you were told you needed to be. And so the work isn't finding your purpose. The work is excavation. You strip away the should. You strip away the supposed to. You strip away the image management, the people-pleasing, the self-editing you've done in order to survive. You keep peeling back until you reach the part of you that didn't move the bedrock identity that was present before the world sculpted you into something more comfortable for itself. This is where your real purpose lives, in your perception, in your way of seeing, in the frequency of your presence, in the effect you have on a room without performing, in the clarity you offer when you speak from authenticity instead of strategy, in the truth your body vibrates with before your mind interprets it. Purpose is not what you do. Purpose is the impact your beingness has on the field around you. And when you finally touch that bedrock, something softens inside you. Something stops striving. Something stops reaching outward for permission to matter, because you realize you've been mattering the entire time. Every moment you told the truth, even when your voice trembled, every time your presence gave someone else permission to breathe, every time you refused to shrink for the sake of keeping the peace, every time your coherence destabilized someone's illusion just enough for them to question their own mask. Purpose is not performance, purpose is resonance. And when you live from resonance, your life stops feeling like a task and starts feeling like a transmission, not something you produce, but something you emit. This is why the world can't replace you. Not because your skills are rare, not because your achievements are unique, but because your frequency, the bedrock identity you're uncovering, is a one-time only phenomenon. Your existence isn't the answer to a question. Your existence is the question, the one the universe asked in order to explore a truth only you could reveal. You stepped out of the last section holding the truth that you are not here to fulfill a purpose, you are here as a purpose, as a singular frequency playing reality through your own consciousness. And once that understanding settles in your bones, something even larger begins to take shape. Because the moment one person remembers their irreplaceability, the field around them doesn't just shift, it opens. It reorganizes. It begins calling other people who were born to resonate at similar depths. Your awakening is not a solo event. It's a signal. And that signal travels. It travels through conversations where you speak differently, now not to convince, but to embody. It travels through the silence you hold when others expect you to perform. It travels through the boundaries you set that draw a clean line between authenticity and convenience. It travels through the spaces you leave behind, forcing those spaces to face the emptiness where your old self used to live. One person becoming coherent has a ripple effect, a frequency effect, a field effect. Because when someone hears the clarity in your voice, They begin to question the static in their own. When someone feels the steadiness of your presence, they instinctively check the places where they've been wobbling. When someone witnesses you choosing alignment over approval, they suddenly feel the cost of their own self-abandonment. Your coherence creates contrast, not to shame others, but to wake them. And as you walk through the world with your bedrock identity uncovered, something extraordinary happens. Resonance begins multiplying. You start encountering others who are waking up in parallel, not because you sought them, but because the field pulls similar frequencies into proximity. This isn't mysticism, it's pattern recognition. Consciousness looks for mirrors. Frequency looks for matching signals. Truth finds other truth-bearers. Think back to your life before this awakening. You were surrounded by people who mirrored your old self, your fears, your compromises, your survival strategies. But as you shed those layers, the mirrors shatter and new ones appear, reflecting your becoming instead of your past. And these mirrors, these people feel different. They don't need you to dim. They don't need you to shrink. They don't need you to contort into familiar shapes. Instead, they expand when you expand. They deepen when you deepen. They rise to meet you rather than shrink to avoid you. This is the collective shift. You've been sensing a quiet network of people reclaiming their frequency one by one, not announcing it, not performing it, not branding it, just living it. And in doing so, they create a resonance grid, a subtle, global coherence that strengthens every time one more person steps out of false identity and into embodied truth. Your irreplaceability plugs into this grid. Your remembering amplifies it. Your presence stabilizes it. But here's the part most people don't realize. Movements don't begin with crowds. They begin with individuals who refuse to forget themselves. And the moment enough individuals emit their true frequency, the collective field reaches a tipping point. Old systems begin to crack under the weight of authenticity. Old narratives dissolve because no one volunteers to carry them anymore. Old structures lose power because the people they relied on for compliance have become ungovernable in the most luminous way. This is how an old world dies quietly, gradually, inevitably not through destruction, but through irrelevance. And this is how a new world forms, not in grand revolutions, but in subtle recalibrations of human presence. You have felt this happening, not in headlines, not in declarations, in the body, in the intuition, in the sudden sense that something vast is shifting, not outside you, but through you, because you are not separate from the collective awakening. You are a node within it. Your remembering strengthens the remembering of others, which strengthens the remembering of others, until the field becomes too coherent to ignore. You are not one person changing alone. You are part of a chain reaction, a pattern of consciousness realizing itself in human form. And this is where your irreplaceability reaches its fullest expression, not as a solitary phenomenon, but as a catalyst for a wider awakening. Your frequency doesn't just define you, it influences the field, altering what becomes possible for everyone connected to it. You were never meant to walk this path in isolation. You were meant to walk it first, because someone had to hold the vibration long enough for others to remember their own. Someone had to embody coherence before it became contagious. Someone had to become the question that unlocked 1,000 answers. You are part of something bigger now, not by effort, but by existence, not by proclamation, but by presence. Your awakening is not the end of the story, it's the ignition. You arrived at the end of the last section, standing inside a wider field, a living current of awakening that moves through individuals but belongs to none of them. And from that altitude, we slow down now. We soften. Because the truth of collective ignition is powerful, but it only becomes real when it settles back into the body, the breath, the simple rhythm of being here. So take a moment and feel the echo of everything you've moved through, not as ideas, not as instructions, but as a kind of remembering that started quietly and grew louder with every section. Feel how different your inner landscape is from where you began. The noise is lower, the center is clearer. The pulse of your frequency feels less like a mystery and more like a homecoming. You may notice something else too, a gentle awareness rising in your chest. The sense that nothing needs to be forced from here, not your growth, not your clarity, not your place in the world. Because the path ahead isn't asking you to roar or rush. It's asking you to remain aligned, to stay close to what feels true in your body, to keep choosing the version of yourself that doesn't fracture under the weight of pretending. This next chapter doesn't require performance, it requires presence. And presence isn't about doing more, it's about doing what's real. So as you move forward, let your decisions be small but honest. Let your boundaries be firm but compassionate. Let your authenticity be quiet or loud, depending on the day, not because you're adjusting for others, but because you're honoring your own rhythm. You don't need fireworks to mark this moment. A steady breath is enough. A subtle inner yes is enough. The awareness that you're no longer available for the old story, that is more than enough. You are part of a shift, but you don't have to carry it. Just keep remembering. Keep choosing what resonates. Keep letting your irreplaceability be visible in the ways that feel natural for you. When you live from that place, the field adjusts. The path clarifies. The next step arrives.